It was a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other, or at least pretended to. The street was lined with neat lawns, white picket fences, and houses that looked nearly identical. For years, it had been a place of peace and routine, until the Johnson family moved in. The Johnsons were a warm and friendly black family, eager to start fresh in what they believed was a welcoming community. Little did they know, their arrival would awaken the hidden prejudices of one particular neighbor. Mrs. Whitaker lived next door. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a reputation for being overly involved in everyone else's business. She was always peeking through her blinds, watching for anything she deemed out of place. From the moment the Johnsons moved in, Mrs. Whitaker had her doubts. "They don't fit the vibe of this neighborhood," she whispered to a friend over the phone. That whisper soon turned into a storm of gossip and lies. Mrs. Whitaker began spreading rumors about the Johnsons. At first, it was subtly comments about their lawn being unkempt or their kids being too loud while playing in the yard. But soon, her accusations became malicious. She told neighbors that the Johnsons were involved in illegal activities, claiming she saw suspicious people coming and going from their home late at night. She suggested they might be dealing drugs or worse. None of it was true, but Mrs. Whitaker had a way of making her lies sound believable. Word spread quickly. The Johnsons noticed their once friendly neighbors had started keeping their distance. Invitations to neighborhood events stopped coming. People avoided eye contact when they walked their dog or picked up their mail. At first, the Johnsons were confused, then hurt. They couldn't understand what had changed. One day, Mrs. Whitaker went a step further. She called the local homeowners association to file a formal complaint about the Johnsons. "They're bringing down the property values," she argued, her voice dripping with indignation. She claimed she had evidence of their supposed activities, though she conveniently never produced any. The Ho, influenced by her persistence, decided to pay the Johnsons an unannounced visit. That afternoon, when the Ho representatives knocked on the Johnsons' door, they were met with polite smiles and an invitation to come inside. The Johnsons calmly addressed every concern, even offering to show their clean records and proof of their community involvement. The Ho left the house visibly embarrassed, realizing they'd been duped by Mrs. Whitaker's baseless claims. But Mrs. Whitaker wasn't done. Frustrated that her attempts to drive the Johnsons out had failed, she resorted to a more public display. She posted a rant on the neighborhood social media group, accusing the Johnsons of being bad influences and claiming she had video evidence to prove it. What she didn't realize was that this post would backfire spectacularly. Within minutes, other neighbors began commenting, asking for proof of her claims. When Mrs. Whitaker failed to provide any, people started questioning her motives. A few neighbors, tired of her meddling, defended the Johnsons. "They're nothing but kind and respectful," one neighbor wrote. Another added, "Maybe it's time we look at who's really causing trouble here." The tide was turning. Just 7 minutes after her post went up, karma took over in an unexpected way. The Johnsons, who had been quietly dealing with the fallout of Mrs. Whitaker's lies, decided to respond. They posted a heartfelt message, explaining how they had felt unwelcome since moving in and thanking the neighbors who had shown them kindness. They didn't mention Mrs. Whitaker by name but addressed the rumors directly, denying them with grace and dignity. They even included photos of their family volunteering at local events, their children's honor roll certificates, and a glowing recommendation letter from their previous neighborhood association. The community's response was swift and overwhelming. Dozens of neighbors commented, apologizing for believing Mrs. Whitaker's lies and expressing their support for the Johnsons. Some even called out Mrs. Whitaker directly, accusing her of racism and causing unnecessary division. The social media group turned into a rallying cry for unity, with neighbors organizing a block party to formally welcome the Johnsons. As for Mrs. Whitaker, her world quickly unraveled. The Hoe reprimanded her for filing false complaints, and her reputation in the neighborhood was irreparably damaged. People who once tolerated her nosiness now avoided her completely. She became an outcast, left to watch from behind her blinds as the block party she wasn't invited to unfolded on the Johnsons' lawn. The Johnsons, meanwhile, found a renewed sense of belonging. They formed new friendships and became active members of the community, proving that kindness and resilience could overcome even the most insidious prejudice. As for Mrs. Whitaker, she learned it too late that the lies we spread about others often come back to haunt us. As time passed, the neighborhood transformed in ways no one had anticipated. The Johnsons became an integral part of the community, hosting game nights, organizing charity drives, and even starting a small book club that brought together people from all walks of life. Their warmth and generosity had a ripple effect, inspiring others to open up and connect in ways they hadn't before. It seemed that the Johnsons' presence had not only challenged old biases but also created a stronger sense of unity among the neighbors. But for Mrs. Whitaker, things continued to spiral downward. The once proud overseer of the street now found herself utterly alone. Her efforts to mend her reputation fell flat, as her neighbors avoided her at every turn. Even her longtime friends were hesitant to be seen with her, not wanting to be associated with her toxic behavior. Each day felt heavier than the last as the weight of her actions bore down on her. One day, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Whitaker's pristine lawn, the crown jewel of her carefully curated home, was overrun by a burst pipe. Water gushed onto her property, flooding her flower beds and ruining the landscaping she'd worked so hard to maintain. In her panic, she tried to stop the flow herself but quickly realized the problem was beyond her control. She called a plumber, but they couldn't come for hours. Just when it seemed like she'd have to watch her yard be destroyed, she heard a knock at the door. It was Mr. Johnson, holding a toolkit and wearing a calm, reassuring smile. "Heard you might need some help," he said, as if nothing had ever happened between them. For a moment, Mrs. Whitaker was stunned into silence. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she didn't need his help, but the truth was, she did. Reluctantly, she stepped aside and let him in. Mr. Johnson worked swiftly, finding the shut-off valve and helping to clear out the standing water. As he worked, Mrs. Whitaker found herself watching him, trying to reconcile this kind act with the lies she had spread about him. Why would he help her after everything she'd done? The question hung in her mind like a heavy fog. When the job was done, Mr. Johnson packed up his tools and prepared to leave. "You didn't have to do this," Mrs. Whitaker said quietly, her voice tinged with something close to shame. He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "I know. But that's not who we are." His words lingered in the air long after he'd left. After Mr. Johnson left, Mrs. Whitaker sat by her window, staring at the now quiet street. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone, not because of the neighbors avoiding her, but because she realized the isolation she had created for herself. She thought about all the opportunities she had wasted to be a better neighbor, a better person. The following week, Mrs. Whitaker did something she hadn't done in years. She baked a pie. Apple, her specialty. Carrying it carefully, she made her way to the Johnsons' home. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door, unsure if they would even answer. When Mrs. Johnson opened the door, her warm smile caught Mrs. Whitaker off guard. I wanted to bring this over as a thank you," Mrs. Whitaker said awkwardly, holding out the pie. Mrs. Johnson hesitated for just a moment before taking it. "That's very kind of you. Would you like to come in?" Mrs. Whitaker wasn't expecting the invitation. She nodded, stepping inside for the first time. The Johnsons' home was cozy and inviting, filled with laughter and the smell of something delicious cooking in the kitchen. She felt a pang of guilt as she realized how wrong she'd been about them. As they sat down, Mrs. Whitaker began to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush. She admitted to everything of the rumors, the lies, and the harm she had caused. Tears welled up in her eyes as she apologized, her voice breaking. "I was wrong, and I can't take it back, but I want to do better," she said. The Johnsons listened quietly, their expressions soft but unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then, Mr. Johnson spoke. "We appreciate your apology. It's not easy to admit when you've hurt someone. But moving forward, it's about what you do, not just what you say." That moment marked the beginning of a slow but meaningful change. Mrs. Whitaker started small, attending the book club the Johnsons had organized and participating in community events she had once dismissed. She even volunteered to help with a neighborhood food drive the Johnsons were hosting. It wasn't easy earning back trust never easy, but she persisted. The neighborhood, once divided by her actions, began to heal. Mrs. Whitaker, though still reserved, started to rebuild her relationships. She no longer peered out of her blinds in judgment. Instead, she opened her door to conversation. The Johnsons continued to thrive, their kindness and resilience becoming the glue that held the community together. And while Mrs. Whitaker would always carry the weight of her past mistakes, she found a new purpose in doing better each day, not out of guilt, but out of a genuine desire to contribute to the peace and unity she had once disrupted. The neighborhood was no longer just a collection of houses, it was a community, bound by lessons learned, second chances, and the courage to move forward. And in the quiet moments, as Mrs. Whitaker tended to her garden or waved to the Johnsons across the street, she knew she was a part of it too.